I was looking through my files today, Jack, looking for some cases where there had been tangible evidence of the existence of these things, and I came across a case there at Campinas, Brazil in September of 1953, where about 8 or 9 ounces of pure tin fell out of one of these things, which was evidently in difficulty at very low altitude over the residential section of Campinas, which is about 250 miles inland from Sao Paulo, I believe. And the government collected this tin and closed off the neighborhood till they got it. It got over rooftops, bird holes, and clothing and everything else. It was dribbling out of the edge of one of these so-called saucers.
Well,
They publicly stated that this was tin from a flying saucer. They turned part of it over to our Air Force, and I know that a Dr. Meaning out in Ohio at Ohio College, Northern College, was one of those who analyzed the stuff.
Well, I understand that the Brazilian government does admit there are flying saucers, which is probably the only government that does admit.
I think you're right about that. They not only admit it, but they release pictures with their photographers.
Well, that's what I was just about to say. I spoke to Leonard Lyons, I think it was, from the boat. And he had been on a junket or a trip down to Brazil. And he was in the presence of the guy that runs Brazil. And he had seen pictures of the flying saucers. And I believe motion pictures.
Well, I'm sure they have motion pictures, and they search. Well, I know they do, and because they were taken by an official photographer for the Brazilian fleet about 2 years ago. They got quite a bit of them. They got 35 millimeter motion pictures, and they got a lot of color pictures.
I recall the still photos.
Spherical thing moving along over the mountains along the coast.
Yes.
And the Brazilian government was quite frank in saying that this is an unidentified flying object. And, of course, it was only one of several.
Now, did you read the report in State Magazine of the New Guinea sightings?
Yes.
Of the priests who had seen them? And
in fact, 2 or 3 priests
reported that 4 or 5 seemingly human beings got up on top of the flying saucer and waved down to he and his flock.
They seem to be responding to their gestures, according
to... He returned 3 or 4 days, and there were several of them.
Yes, I saw that.
And that he did a great deal of soul searching to find out that it tried to figure if this was hallucinatory, and he came to the final decision where it wasn't, and it was absolutely what he'd seen, because not only did he see it, but 30 or 40 of his flock saw it with him.
I have a copy of that original report, which runs to several single-space typewritten pages, and of course was considerably more in detail than what they printed in the magazine.
And of course there's the other story of the priest who saw the flying saucer that was called to the Vatican to report on it.
Yes.
I think it was in Italy. I might be mistaken about it.
There have been quite a few sightings over in Italy, and some very good ones.
Well, of course, there have been some phonies. Those guys leaning on the railing, for instance, looking at the...
That's that pyramid of Sicily.
Yeah, where their sight line is absolutely out of sync with the object they have.
They're supposed to see. Of course, you've seen the phony picture, I'm sure, of the spacecraft over the steel mill in Ohio.
Oh, yes, yes.
And every one of those things is nothing but a...
and also the one over Atlantic City.
Yeah.
Somebody threw a plate out the window.
Well, the ones over Ohio, over the steel mill, are reflections between the elements of the lens. And each bright light has a little spacecraft on the opposite side of the negative pointing directly at it.
That's
they
right.
seem to have an affinity for bright light.
I think probably the most believable manifestation of saucers was the motion picture in the picture. I think, was it called flying saucers or UFO?
UFOs, I believe. And this, I think you're talking about the
over the ball
taken by this, Great Falls, Montana.
Yes.
And then the movie's taken over the desert by Delbert Newhouse, this Navy war.
Well, they only had one, I think it was the motion picture of the flying saucers flying over the ball field. And if I remember correctly, it went behind the
water tower or something.
The water tower or something like that, and that was the end of the picture. I don't think they showed the other ones that you speak of.
Well, they were very good. They were taken in 16mm color by Delbert Newhouse, a Navy war officer near Tremont, Utah.
Well, where are those pictures now?
They've been released in some movie, and
I haven't seen them.
I saw them in the original 16mm form, but I never saw them on the street. No, they were in some movie.
Well, now I'll tell you a strange thing that happened one time, and as much as I labeled as flying saucers, if there are really such things. I said, now let's you and I do a documentary on flying saucers. I said, now who do you know in Washington that would know if there are flying saucers, or who would tell us that it's just a fool's gold and we should forget about it? And he says, I got the guy, General so-and-so. And we called the guy up. And the guy said to Ed, he says, now look, don't get me in this thing. I don't want to get near it. It's too hot down here. I don't want to handle it. He said, and you might as well forget about the project. You'll get no cooperation. And Morrow hung up the phone, and he looked at me, and he repeated what the guy said to him on the phone, because I couldn't hear him, actually. Yeah. And he looked at me, and he said, how about that? They're all flying.
Jack, was this after 1952?
This was 1956, I imagine.
Well, now, you see, in 1952, on 2 nights in July, these so-called flying saucers were over Washington. They were...
Yeah, I remember that.
All right. But what most people don't know is that on August the 13th, just 3 weeks later, there were 68 of them over Washington at one time on that night. I was right there in Washington at the time. I was on the mutual network. I had excellent contacts. But the lid of censorship was so tight that I knew nothing about this, and I'm sure that no other newsmen knew it either. And I knew nothing about it until 2 years later, when I happened, through a friendly official of the CIA, I got a copy of a document which they printed, how to identify and track unidentified flying objects. And this was put out to radar control men and pilots and others. And in there they list all these 68 objects that were over Washington on that one night, August 13th, 1952.
Are we on? To those that may be listening to us, a couple of minutes ago, Jackie Gleason was talking on our beeper phone set up with Frank Edwards.
Is Frank still there, by the way?
Yes, he's still here, but he will be listening on the can.
Right.
He can't enter into the conversation for a moment.